In 2010, Eric Establie, one of the world's most skilled cave divers, descended into the treacherous depths of Dragonnière Gaud Cave in France. What began as a routine exploration dive turned into a life-and-death struggle when an underwater avalanche, a rare and deadly event, sealed him within the cave's dark passages. This story recounts Eric's desperate fight for survival in suffocating darkness and the heroic efforts of elite rescue divers who raced against time through near impossible conditions to save him. These are the final moments of the Dragonnière Cave diving tragedy. On Sunday, October 3rd, 2010, Eric stepped into the Dragonnière Gaud Cave with purpose, his heart beating with a mix of excitement and nerves. This dive was different. He planned to push beyond the limits of the mapped sections, venturing 3,412 feet into the cave at a depth of 285 feet. It was a 6-hour mission into the unknown, and he had meticulously prepared for it. His equipment included 2 rebreathers, 2 scooters, 5 air tanks, and 1,476 feet of dive line, everything he needed to face the challenges ahead. For Eric, this cave was more than a challenge, it was an obsession. Dragonnière Gaud Cave was infamous among divers for being one of the most technically demanding caves on Earth, a labyrinth where one wrong move could seal your fate. He dived it repeatedly, each time adding to his intricate maps of its labyrinthine tunnels. Some would say that this was his life's work, his true passion. Now descending into the depths, Eric's focus sharpened. The world above seemed to fade as he immersed himself in the silence of the cave. Each passage he navigated brought him closer to uncharted territory, the allure of discovery driving him onward. By the time he reached 1,200 feet, the dive was progressing smoothly until disaster struck. A single unintended brush against the muddy cave wall sent clouds of silt swirling into the water. In seconds, his visibility vanished into a suffocating blackness. Eric paused, startled by how quickly the conditions had deteriorated. He knew he couldn't risk pushing through the blackout. If he moved blindly, his equipment could snag on a jagged edge, potentially cutting his airline or rupturing his buoyancy vest. Either mistake could send him sinking into the abyss. Forced to wait, he remained calm, hoping the silt would settle. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, but finally, the murk began to clear. Relieved but cautious, Eric resumed his dive, inching deeper into the cave. Yet even with the powerful beam of his headlamp, visibility remained a mere 12 inches. He strained to make out the walls and ensure his gear didn't catch on the surrounding rocks. Alone in the impenetrable darkness, with nothing but the hum of his rebreathers and the echo of his own heartbeat, Eric pressed on. The cave had swallowed him whole, leaving him isolated in a pitch-black void. But for Eric, this was the cost of exploration, a risk he had accepted long before this dive began. After some time, Eric discovered a narrow passage and carefully squeezed through, emerging on the other side. But in that instant, the unthinkable happened, the nightmare of every cave diver, an underwater rockfall. Debris loomed all around him, threatening to collapse further at any moment. He had no choice but to surge forward, but his sudden movements stirred the silt even more. In an instant, his vision disappeared into choking blackness. His headlamp, powerful as it was useless against the suffocating cloud of debris. Panic clawed at him, but Eric knew one thing: he had to move. He felt his way along the rocks, searching desperately for a way through. Every path was blocked, every gap sealed. His air supply ticked down with every passing second. The reality hit hard. He was trapped, and his only exit was now sealed shut. The rockfall, meters thick, cut him off entirely. Now, Eric was on the wrong side of the collapse, alone, with no escape. As his air dwindled, Eric refused to give in. Every movement was deliberate, every second a fight against suffocation. He desperately clawed at the rockfall, feeling the sharp edges of stone dig into his hands as he searched for even the smallest gap that could lead to freedom. His determination never faltered, even as the odds closed in around him. When Eric failed to surface at his designated time, the alarm was raised. Every second that passed meant his chances of survival dwindled. By the next morning, on October 4th, British and Swiss rescue divers had arrived, ready to face the deadly cave that had swallowed him whole. Among them were two of the world's most elite cave divers, Rick Stanton and John Valanthan, names etched into history for their role in one of the most famous cave rescues, locating 12 trapped boys and their coach in Thailand after 9 harrowing days. Rick Stanton, a veteran British diver, had dedicated decades to cave rescue through organizations like the Cave Rescue Organization and the British Rescue Council. Together with John Valanthan, they were considered the pinnacle of European cave diving expertise, masters of navigating the impossible. These two men weren't just divers, they were saviors in the most extreme environments, diving where few dared to go. Their presence brought a glimmer of hope, but the challenge before them was immense. Dragonnière Gaud Cave was no ordinary cave. It was a labyrinth of danger, and finding Eric would test even their unmatched skills. Time was the enemy, and every moment mattered. Rick Stanton and John Valanthan actually knew Eric personally. Years earlier, he had helped John gain access to another cave in France, forging a bond of mutual respect among experts. So when the call came, they didn't hesitate for even a second. They packed their gear, knowing the odds were slim, but determined to try. Alongside them, they carried first aid supplies, food and heat packs, anything that might help Eric if they found him alive. Their mission was expected to last 5 to 7 hours, and a Swiss dive team was on standby, ready to follow if needed. At 3 p.m., Rick and John descended into the Dragonnière Gaud Cave. Every push forward demanded precision and endurance. With the weight of their mission bearing down on them, they weren't just navigating one of the most dangerous cave systems on Earth, they were racing against time, knowing their friend's life hung in the balance. Their goal was to push as far as the known exploration site, 3,000 feet into the cave, but almost immediately, the cave fought back. Visibility was nearly non-existent, the water thick with sediment that clung to everything, blinding even the powerful lights mounted to their helmets. At 2,427 feet, the source of the chaos became clear. What Rick later described as an underwater avalanche had disturbed the cave floor, unleashing a relentless cloud of mud and silt. This underwater avalanche was a phenomenon so rare it's almost unheard of, transforming the cave from a calculated risk to an inescapable trap. As they reached the rockfall, they discovered a small opening, hope, but barely. The bulk of their equipment made it impossible to squeeze through, leaving them stranded just 2,559 feet from the entrance. With their air running low, they had no choice but to turn back. It was a crushing setback. Not only had they failed to locate Eric, but the rockfall posed a massive challenge. Clearing it seemed impossible at this point. By Wednesday morning, new strategies were underway. A civil engineering team worked tirelessly to dig an impassable vertical shaft, hoping to reach the upstream part of the cave. Meanwhile, cavers scoured a nearby cave, searching for a potential connection to the Dragonnière system. If such a link existed, it might lead to Eric, or at least provide a way out if he had found an air pocket. But not all air pockets are safe havens. Air pockets might seem like a tempting lifeline, but in caves like Dragonnière, they often hide a deadly secret. These pockets can contain toxic gases, waiting to incapacitate any diver foolish enough to take an unfiltered breath. A single inhalation could lead to dizziness, acidosis, and eventually death. Time was slipping away, and the odds of finding Eric alive grew slimmer by the hour. The Swiss dive team mounted their next rescue attempt as soon as the silt began to settle. Navigating through the murky waters, they made it to the rockfall without issue. Yet, despite hours of searching for a passage, every path was blocked. Their air supplies dwindling, they were forced to retreat and resupply, leaving the question of Eric's fate unanswered. Meanwhile, on the surface, a trench was being dug with heavy machinery in a desperate bid to access the cave from above. The team had pinpointed the location where Eric was likely trapped and began clearing rocks from a narrow fissure. They managed to dig down about 50 feet, but there was still 210 feet to go before reaching the cave's passage. If Eric had found a survivable air pocket, this aperture could be his only chance. At the same time, Rick Stanton and John Valanthan prepared for their second rescue dive. This time, they collaborated with expert divers to refine their approach. Using slimmer equipment, they aimed to forcibly squeeze through a tight gap in the rockfall. As the divers navigated through the cave system and returned to the site of Eric's emergency scooter, the grim reality of his situation became clear. They discovered signs that Eric had tried to crawl through the debris himself. A narrow gap in the rockfall could provide a way forward, but it was too risky to proceed without additional preparation. Now armed with this vital new information, Rick and John surfaced again, determined to regroup and attempt one final push. Time was running out, and so was hope. After resting and resupplying, Rick and John prepared for their third and most critical dive. Time was of the essence, but they knew this was their best and possibly last chance to reach Eric. They moved through the cave with urgency, navigating to the rockfall in record time. There was no turning back now. The pair had to push through the narrow gap they'd identified near the ceiling of the rockfall. However, one wrong move could dislodge silt from the ceiling above, plunging them into total darkness. Every movement was calculated, each second tense with the possibility of a blackout. Miraculously, they made it through. On the other side, hope flickered briefly. The path ahead was open, but there was still no sign of Eric. Undeterred, they swam deeper, another 600 feet into the unexplored parts of the cave. Every foot they covered pushed the limits of risk and endurance, but Rick and John's unshakable focus and experience drove them forward. They clung to the hope that Eric might have found a safe air pocket and was waiting to be rescued. In the eerie stillness of the cave, the visibility finally cleared. As they progressed through the long, quiet passage, they spotted something below them. 15 feet beneath their position, they saw him, Eric. The sight was both shocking and heartbreaking. He had made it farther than anyone thought possible, deeper into the cave than anyone could comprehend. It was clear he had been desperately searching for an air pocket, but his air supply had run out before he could find one. The realization hit hard. Eric's unwavering determination carried him to his final moments, but ultimately, the cave claimed him as its own. Rick and John floated in silence, their mission now shifting from rescue to recovery. In the end, it took 8 long days to locate Eric's body deep within the labyrinth of Dragonnière Gaud Cave. Rick and John knew the task ahead would be grueling. Carefully, they prepared Eric's remains for the journey back to the surface. However, as they made their way out, the cave dealt one final, cruel blow. In the narrow gap of the rockfall, Eric's body became stuck. The cave seemed to tighten its grip, as if refusing to release the man who had spent so many years within its depths. Rick and John tried to maneuver it through, but the space was too tight. For one of them to push from behind would mean becoming trapped themselves, a risk neither could afford to take. Rick and John had to make the unthinkable decision to abandon their friend, the weight of that moment haunting them as they swam away. Dragonnière had claimed Eric, sealing him forever in the place that had defined so much of his life. Their focus now turned to retrieving his dive computer, still strapped to his wrist. It was their only hope of understanding what had gone wrong. Even with Eric's recovery out of reach, Rick and John's mission was far from over. They had pushed themselves to the brink, using massive amounts of air in the process. The return trip was dangerous, and every second counted. Clutching the dive computer, they retraced their steps through the unforgiving cave. The darkness and silence were relentless, but they pressed on, knowing they couldn't falter. Fortunately, they avoided further complications and made it back to the entrance alive. The dive computer was handed over to French authorities, providing a chilling record of Eric's final moments. It revealed that he had drowned on the first day of his dive, likely soon after the rockfall trapped him. Weeks of effort and hope came to a sobering conclusion. Despite the heroic attempts, Eric's body remained beyond reach. On January 8, 2011, the French Speleology Federation officially announced the end of recovery operations. Eric's body still lies within the cave, sealed in the place that had both inspired and ultimately claimed him. If you made it this far, consider subscribing for more videos detailing the final moments of the most horrific tragedies in human history. Thanks for watching.